Okay. Hi. My advocate's claim is that ADHD is overdiagnosed in children. She has three secondary claims to support her claim. First, the way determining ADHD is ineffective. Second, how many children are falsely diagnosed with ADHD. And third, why overdiagnosing ADHD is dangerous. Now, my advocate's first claim, the advocate first claims that the way determining ADHD is ineffective. Her sub-arguments are that in her argument, she points out how the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, is used to diagnose children with ADHD for the past 19 years. And she looks into how the DSM looks for indicators of ADHD, including inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, which can be normal characteristics that are found in children, that are normal in kids when they're growing up. She also explains how not all doctors use the DSM, even though it is required, and she also and if that all doctors or clinicians were to utilize the DSM, less children will be falsely diagnosed with ADHD. So there's a bit of a contradictory for my advocate's secondary claim. She argues that the DSM isn't an effective tool to diagnose children, but if that more doctors would use it, less children will be falsely diagnosed. According to the American Psychiatric Association, the first DSM was published in 1952, with revisions coming so often. We are now on the DSM number 5, published in 2013. ADHD first appeared in the second edition of DSM in 1968, and that's according to the American Psychiatric Association. So, contrary to the advocate, the DSM has been used for the past 51 years and not used for the last 19 years for ADHD. According to Jeffrey Epstein from the Department of Pediatricians from the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine, the revision of the ADHD and DSM number 5 are less dramatic than the updates to the earlier revisions of the DSM. So the retention of DSM symptoms, domains, and symptoms are likely reflects a judgment that the DSM number 4 definitions of the ADHD are largely withstood the test of time. So the DSM number 4, before the DSM number 5, the criteria have been proven to be quite effective and reliable of identifying the population of individuals who have significant impairments across a wide range of outcomes. So pretty much the DSM is a good, effective tool to identify ADHD. Now, the DSM is an effective tool to diagnose children with ADHD. The problem is that it is not used correctly, or not all doctors have the time or take the time to use the DSM to identify a child that has ADHD. So that's the main issue there. The advocate's secondary claim is that how many children are falsely diagnosed with ADHD. And her subcategories are that in each region, 5% is a realistic upper limit of children with ADHD. Second, ADHD diagnosis is more common in young boys. 3, there has been an increase in ADHD over time. Her first subclaim, it's more of informative than a claim. Yes, 5% is a realistic limit in children with ADHD. So no argument there. And her second one, ADHD diagnosis more in young boys. She claims that the diagnosis is associated with maturity, and boys are typically known to take more time to mature than girls, resulting in boys being more diagnosed. But according to Leslie Jameson, a licensed psychologist in Columbia in South Carolina, it's that girls have more behavior problems. Is that boys have more behavioral problems, and most girls tend to have more internal behavior problems such as anxiety, social withdrawal, and depression. And most girls are clustered in the inattentive subcategory because they are not behavioral problems and are often overlooked. So that's why more young boys are diagnosed with ADHD. And on our third subcategory, there have been an increase in ADHD over time. That's because according to Faye Dixon, clinical director of UC Davis Mind Institute and ADHD clinic, kids who are being underserved before medically may now have access to resources they didn't have, including things like ADHD screening and referrals for clinical evaluation. And what's more, doctors themselves are better trained to recognize symptoms and diagnose the condition than they were 20 years ago. And that's according to Thomas J. Power, PhD Director of Center Management of ADHD Clinicals in Philadelphia. And lastly, her third secondary claim is that it is being overdiagnosis ADHD is dangerous. She claims that there are side effects associated with HHD stimulants, and those that are falsely medicated are experiencing them without reason. Also, ADHD has become an all-encompassing diagnosis. Again, it's more of an informative to me. I mean, ADHD can be dangerous if overdiagnosed, even with any other medication or prescription. It can be dangerous when overdiagnosed. Thank you.
Right, well, you did a nice job trying to keep things organized. Maybe it's a little over-organized at times because we're going on their first point. Here are 3 points, and on each of those points you've got individual reactions. And some of those individual points you don't really have a dispute on. You, in essence, say, well, that's just informational in nature, and there's not really a claim there. So if that's not where the dispute is, just focus on what the dispute is. I thought you did a nice job, though, on the first point, pointing out that there is a kind of an internal contradiction. Either the DSM works and it's useful, or it doesn't work and it's not useful, and the advocate seems to suggest that it would be useful if it was used properly. So that the real problem here is that there might be an underutilization of this. Then you come back to that, I think, in the last point, and I think that that's one of those things that you could probably tie in a little bit more when you get to that last point, is the thing that you said on the first point, and that is that the DSM has, been used more appropriately recently, and that's why we have a greater diagnosis of these things, that the criteria were solidified and now they have greater access. So it's just a normal result of increased understanding and technical ability to diagnose these things has produced more cases. This is not an example of doctors overdiagnosing something because they have some malignant goal to try and hook kids on drugs or something like that. We recognize that the things that we dismissed before are in fact potential problems for kids. I thought that you do the same sort of thing that you accuse the advocate of, providing some background information on the DSM. The number of, when it was first established, the number of editions that there have been on it. I thought that your argument, however, saying that the fourth version of it has stood the test of time, that there weren't dramatic changes to the fifth, seems to suggest that it is working more effectively, and you actually had a piece of information that suggested that as well. On the second point, when you talked about the percentage of people who are supposedly likely to be diagnosed, I don't remember if the advocate suggested that the numbers were higher than the reasonable 5%, and if they were, how much higher they were. I don't know that that statistic was used in any way by either side in the argument. Both sides seem to accept that as a criteria. Then the question is, well, how much more are we getting than we need? Does it exceed that? And I don't really get a lot of discussion of that. You basically then come back and talk about the assertion that because boys are diagnosed more than girls, that it really has to do with maturity. And I thought you had a good answer on this, and it's not so much maturity as it is that the symptoms are more noticeable in boys because they manifest themselves in ways that are different than they would manifest themselves in girls. And so I thought that was a pretty good explanation about why that differential would exist. And then on the overdiagnosis issue, I've already mentioned that you had a pretty good answer to this. This has got to do with the fact that we have better techniques, the kids have greater access. One of the other things that you might point out is that the culture's changed, parenting styles have changed, and there's a stronger desire to kind of supervise and manage kids. Kids were problems before. Well, those things work themselves out, or they didn't work themselves out. But nowadays, it's like everybody is hovering over their kids and trying to work. They're worried about every little thing, and so maybe that's another reason that we get more of these diagnoses. Maybe they're bigger problems, or maybe the school systems have changed also because they make different kinds of demands on the kids than they did once upon a time. That's a broader argument to be making, and it would require additional research. You're trying to focus on the things that they talked about, and I thought you did a very good job of that. All right, thank you.